each of you, and certainly those that may be finding themselves on YouTube or some other platform. Tonight we do a study, as it were. I'm kind of a word study guy and a case study guy, so I hope that I don't bore you to tears. One of the verses that certainly prompts our thinking along these lines is found in Ecclesiastes 9 and verse number 10, wherein we read, "Whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with thy might." And so we quote that on a regular basis. We use that passage as it relates to our Christian endeavor, as it relates to benevolence, as it relates to our Christian walk. And certainly that is apropos. That is exactly what the verse means. But many times we leave off the last part of that particular verse. For, again, here's a conclusion coming. Do everything to the best of your ability, for there is no work, nor device, nor knowledge, nor wisdom in the grave whither thou goest. And so for a few minutes tonight, I would like for us to consider the idea of the grave. When was the last time you studied the grave? A month? A year? Never? It is one of those things that, it is what it is. It brings a lot of negative connotation. Brother Hilton says we talk about how great heaven is and how wonderful the great hereafter is, but we sure do spend a lot of time and energy trying to stay here. And that's a lot of truth in that. And so a lot of times what we do is we avoid talking about the grave and the connotations that go along with it, right? So for tonight, let's spend just a few minutes talking about that. And certainly as it relates to Ecclesiastes 9 and verse 10, we'll notice the fullness of the text as we go. When you talk about the grave, it's interesting that beginning to talk about such a subject, you think, well, I wonder how much the Bible has to say about it. Well, you'd be surprised. Here's a familiar text that you know as Christians because of Acts chapter 2. In Psalm 16 and verse number 10, you remember the statement is given, "For thou wilt not leave my soul in hell, neither wilt thou suffer thine Holy One to see corruption." You know that verse, don't you? You've heard that verse. We're familiar with that verse. It is that which is quoted in Acts chapter 2 and verse 27 in the very first gospel sermon, referring to the resurrected Christ, right? Well, the word that is highlighted here, hell, I believe possibly the New King maybe has the word Sheol, and that's proper because that's the word. That is the original word. If you go back and look, Sheol is the word that is used there. Sheol brings about a lot of connotation with it. And so what I'm doing here as an introductory thing is to show you how we understand the word Sheol. And so here, what was the connotation? Jesus would not be left, as it were, where? In the sepulcher. He would not be left even in the great hereafter. He would go there, but he would return. We'll think about that. I remembered in Luke chapter 23 and verse number 43, I wrote this down earlier, because you remember what Jesus said to the thief on the cross? "Tonight thou shalt be with me in paradise." And so, if you look with Psalm 16 and verse 10, and you marry that together with Luke 23 and verse 43, certainly we understand it is a grave, it is a sepulcher, right? It was a tomb, a new tomb, that belonged to one Joseph, I believe it was. And so here's an individual that is reflecting, looking forward actually to the resurrected Christ. And that's the statement that is given in Acts chapter 2 and verse 27. So we know a little bit about it already. And it has to do with even the Hades realm. Because Jesus said that's where he was going. And he would not stay there. Even as you see in Luke 16 and verse 10. Here's a thought. You go over and you look at another prophet. You look at Isaiah 5 and verse number 14. And listen to the words here. Remember, this is again inspiration. The Bible says, "Therefore hell hath enlarged herself and opened her mouth without measure." Same word. Sheol. It's the word for the grave, the sepulcher, the burying place, even the place of the dead, the Hadean realm. But notice here, it has an insatiable desire and it has plenty of room. Well, you think back to where we were in Ecclesiastes 9 and verse number 10, we're all going there. There better be room. Death is going to meet us all. And we'll see that in Hebrews 9 and verse 27 shortly. Now, here's another thought. you go back and you think about the situation with Korah. Remember the rebellion with Korah, as it were? You take yourselves back to Numbers chapter 16, and you remember that the earth clave asunder, as it were. The earth opened up and swallowed them. Verse 33 says, as you're reading, and all that appertained to them went down alive into the pit. Guess what that word is? Sheol. It's the same word, seen over it again. So it's a grave. It is the place of the dead. Here, as you watch what's going on within the camp, you see that it is something that is under the ground. And so there are many things that you begin to learn as it relates to this word Sheol. Now, fast forward to the New Testament, John chapter 11, you remember with Lazarus, Jesus therefore again groaning in himself, coming to the grave. Now this is a different word, and certainly has its basis in the word Sheol, but now that we're dealing with the Greek language, it's interesting that Jesus, as he looks to the grave, remember his sister said he's been there 4 days and he stinketh, right? So there was a period of mourning, and then there was a time when they finally put him into the grave, right? And he had been there 4 days upon Jesus' arrival. And so here the word has to do with a remembrance. Kind of interesting, isn't it? Because here there's a location. Notice what the text said. It was a cave. It was a cave with a stone upon it. Sound familiar? There was a lot of that in this particular moment in time. And so Jesus, where was he put? In a cave with a stone upon it. And so here, this is this moment in time when a place is marked. And so when you think about the grave, it is something based on this particular word. The root word has everything to do with a remembrance. It is a place of internment, a place of burial, which we could have guessed by reading the word grave, but it has everything to do with memory. You know, the tomb that we visit, the headstone that we visit and lay flowers at, etc. So it is a place to remember those that had lived before us. Kind of interesting in the original language. So by the time we come back around to Ecclesiastes chapter 9, in verse number 10, notice that the grave is where we're all going. And so let's talk about the text, because the grave is certainly the point of interest that I would bring about tonight, but there has to be an understanding of what comes before the grave, and I think that's certainly what Solomon deals with. So as you think about the text, especially the first sentence of that, you can break it into several ideas. And first of all, we see the certainty of what is going before us, and that is certainly the work that has to be done. So he says, whatsoever thy hand findeth to do. The Bible speaks a lot about that too. The idea of the hand working, as it were. And the very first thing that I thought of, and maybe you would too, is over in Ephesians chapter 4, as Paul talked about, let him that steals a stone steal no more, but rather let him labor. This is the idea of what? Working with the hands, right? And it is approved by God. It is something that is referred to as good. And so here, Paul is telling them that they should be individuals that work with their hands. But you know, Paul, he never got his hands dirty, did he? Well, yes, he did. And so he was not a hypocrite. He was an individual that would practice what he preached. And so there's a benefit that he talks about to the Ephesians. Those that work with their hands are a benefit to others. Certainly we can benefit our immediate family, you know, buying food and groceries, paying the rent, etc. And so there is a benefit to that. But then on the first day of the week, what do? As we give, as we have been prospered by working with our hands, we have the ability to help those that are in need. And that's going to come up again shortly. Now, he was a person that taught that, and he also worked with his hands. You remember over in Acts chapter 18, when he ran into Priscilla and Aquila, what did they do? They were those that worked with their hands. They were tent makers. And so here he found these that were of the same craft and abode with them and wrought. What is that? Working with his hands. And so he was one that worked, and he was a tent maker just like them. Now in Acts chapter 20 and verse number 34, a couple of chapters later, I put this up because he reminded the Ephesian elders that he was one that worked with his hands. Chapter 20 and verse 34 says this, these hands have ministered unto my necessities That is, I supported myself, I worked with my hands, and to them that were with me. And so he was able to work and help not only himself, but those that were around him. And so again, he is an individual that not only spoke it, but practiced it, as you reflect back on Ephesians 4 and verse 28. Now, back to our text, he says immediately, whatsoever thy hand findeth to do. It's just an observation, and it's probably just from the old man's Facebook page, but the idea is it looks like there's a lot of people in the world today that aren't looking for something to do. Just an opinion. You don't have to throw anything at me, but it seems like it's everywhere. People are just not looking for work. Hence, the places that we go, you know, you got to wait 6 hours for something to be served at Taco Bell because there's nobody to work the counter. There's nobody to work the drive-thru. You know, nobody wants to work. But here, as you go back into the letter, he says, whatsoever thy hand findeth to do. Findeth is insistent upon looking, right? Looking for something to do. And so when you find something to do, that is the idea at hand. We are to seize upon that opportunity. Because here in Galatians 6, as you have opportunity, so obviously there's going to be times when opportunity is not presented. But whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, right? That's what we're talking about. Then seize on the opportunity. Do good unto all men, especially those that are of the household of faith. Because that's what Jesus did. The reference here in Acts chapter 10 and verse 38 is that what you're familiar with. It says that he went about doing good and healing those who were oppressed by the devil. And so he was constantly a doer of good. And that's why he would say in chapter 9 verse 4 of John's work, I must work the works of him, God Almighty, the Father, Jehovah, that sent me while it is day. That is, whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, right? He said, I'm doing the work because the night cometh when no man can work. Hence the end of this particular passage in Ecclesiastes 9. The cross was coming, right? The grave was coming. The resurrection was coming. There was a moment in time when that earthly ministry, as it were, would come to a stop. Same with us in Ecclesiastes chapter 9 verse 10. Work with all of your might while it is day, because the grave is coming. And make sure that you're doing the works of him that even sent Jesus Christ. That's a great point to consider. So there is an urgency in doing the work. He expressed that. Matthew 5 and verse 16 in the great beginning of the Sermon on the Mount says that we are to let our light shine. What is that? Whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with all thy might. And so glorify God, Matthew 5 and verse 16, as Jesus did, as he worked the works of him that sent him. Continuing in the text, do it with all thy might. Again, I have been in situations where I've had fellow employees that were let go, as it were, because they just didn't want to put forth the effort. I've worked with people that just couldn't seem to get to work on time. They'd come in 15 minutes late and think, what in the world? What are you mad at me for? I'm here. That's something that's in the world today and probably has been around a lot longer than even I've been alive. But notice that we are to give everything we have got. Whatsoever thy hand findeth to do in your seeking for work, do it with all of your might. That is vigor, capacity, strength, even substance. Paul said, I will gladly spend and be spent for you. Now, I can assume, because of knowing who he is, that he did everything he did with all of his might, and with all of his substance, with all of his capacity. Over in Romans chapter 12, even in a different context, notice the fervor and the vigor that's found here. He that giveth, let him do it with simplicity. He that ruleth with diligence. He that showeth mercy. The idea here that Paul is expressing, whatever it is that is your gift, that is your ability, give it all that you got. 110% we tell our kids, right? 110% and nothing less. Always do it to the best of your ability. In verse 11 in that same passage, if you're following along, says, not slothful in business, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord, ultimately glorifying the Lord. And so be fervent, be instant, be urgent, be diligent in everything that we have to do. Here's another good case study. If you go back and you think about good King Hezekiah, there's a great statement that is found in 2 Chronicles 31 and verse 21 that certainly all of us could mimic to a certain degree. It says here, the work that he was doing, and every work that he began in the service of the house of God and in the law and in the commandments to seek his God, he did it with all his heart. That is synonymous with the giving of the law and the loving of the Lord your God, which Jesus quotes in Mark chapter 12 in verse number 30 as he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. The word some or a portion is never used there. And so Hezekiah was one of those that prospered, that was blessed in his doing, as you read in James chapter 1, because he gave it his all. And that's a great example for all of us. Now, what's the purpose of this? When you think about this particular statement, whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with all thy might. Because in the grave, there ain't none of that. There is no working, there is no glorifying, there is no praising, there is nothing going on in the grave. Because time for you to do the business of the Lord, to do those things that you find to do, have stopped. It is the beginning of the hereafter. It is the beginning of the afterlife. And so, why give so much diligence? Because the grave is coming. And so, in Luke chapter 17, and verse number 10, at the end of the day, at the end of the week, when we have the opportunity to look back, might we all simply have the ability to say, we have done that which was our duty to do. Similar to the way that Ronnie showed us this last week in Mark 14 and verse 8 of the widow, that she had done what she could. May that always be said of each of us. We have done everything that we could. We have given it our best. And so, when you think about the initial statement of the text, we certainly magnify that and use it on many different platforms in sermonic thought. But when you look at the follow-up, do it with all your might, with 110%, because ultimately death is coming for us all. And that's what Solomon says. All of us are going there. Now, obviously, when you do this particular study, you find out that all of us are going to the grave. The Bible mentions at least 4 different categories of people that are going to the grave. Kind of interesting as you break this down in thought. The first one, obviously, as harsh as it is to say, is the child. The Bible tells us even of David losing his child. That is, God taking the child, certainly because of his mass transgressions. And that was a punishment that he paid. And here, he makes the statement, I shall go to him, but he shall not return to me. The idea is there, the child has been reclaimed by God because he was sinlessly perfect. And so if I live in such a way that I can be hearing, well done, thou good and faithful servant in the last day, then I will go to him. I will see him again. And what certainly we say that of those that have gone on before us. Hopefully we will live in such a fashion that we can again see them one day. So when you marry that together with a passage such as Mark 5 and verse number 35, you remember the ruler that was receiving the message, thy daughter is dead. Now, how old was this daughter? Well, if you back up a couple of verses, the Bible tells us there in verse number 23, in verse number 23, he refers to this daughter that is now announced to be dead, my little daughter. And so this was a young child. And so yes, absolutely, the possibility is there that a child can die. The first tragedy we see, not necessarily of a child, but of a child, quote unquote, in the Bible is in the beginning of the book of Genesis. A mother and father lose a child early on. Certainly a tragedy, but it's something that absolutely is a possibility. Also, when you're thinking about this idea, the wicked are seen as those that are dying, that are going to the grave, as it were. And So in Ecclesiastes chapter 8, I saw the wicked buried who had come and gone from this place of the holy, and they were forgotten in the city where they had done so. And so you think about those that are wicked are mentioned as dying in the great recompense that belongs to them. We mentioned this morning, 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, beginning of verse 7. Luke 16 and verse 22, do you remember the context there? In Luke 16, Jesus is teaching about the Hadean realm, right? Paradise, Tartarus, the Gulf. And you remember who went there? The rich man, who is seen as being very wicked. And he said, I have 5 wicked brothers, ultimately is what he says. And I need somebody to warn them. So the wicked are also those that are heading toward the grave. Marry that together with Matthew chapter 26 and verse 24. Jesus says, woe unto that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It had been good for that man if he had not been born. Strong words. Would you agree? How would you like Jesus to say that about me or about you? A tough thing indeed, and certainly nothing that we would want to hear. The example here is a wasted life. They didn't have to join into that procession. Crucify him, give us Barabbas. They didn't have to join into that, but they did. And Jesus pronounces woe upon that man. It had been better if he had not been born. And so, children, possibility of going to the grave, certainly. The wicked, possibility of going to the grave, as well as even a third class, the erring, the apostate, as we refer to in the book of Hebrews, the erring, those that have gone astray. And Peter, in 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 21, it said it had been better for them not to have known the way of righteousness than to have turned from it. You think about that, knowing the glories of heaven, knowing what is waiting on us and then giving it up, going astray as it were. That's the reason for the fervor, for the veracity of the book of Hebrews, calling these people back. Because to know the way of truth and to lay it aside and end up in hell, it's just going to be that much worse. So the erring, those as referred to in Matthew chapter 11, those that proclaim to be righteous as it were, it should be more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon, ranked sinners, yes, than for you. That is even the Pharisaical mindset, the religious leaders of the day, those that said, Lord, Lord, have we not? And so the erring, those that have gone astray. And then finally, obviously, there's the faithful. There's those that are pronounced in Revelation 14 and 13 as being blessed, that they are the ones that die in the Lord. And so the faithful are the ones that we certainly want to think about, obviously, as we head toward the grave, one in each of us. Chapter 2 and verse 10 of the same book says, be thou faithful unto death, right? And so that's what we're in the process of doing. We're looking forward to dying as a faithful child of God. Philippians 1 and verse 23 is one of those verses that is quoted on a regular basis. Paul, as he looked forward to death, he said, certainly it's needful for me to be here, but man, to be with Christ is far better. So to die as a faithful child, Revelation 14 verse 13, far better. Far better. Well, we come back full circle and we find ourselves at the grave. And I end this way because I'm thinking about the way that others have viewed death, have viewed the grave. And it gives us some insight perhaps into the way that we should be thinking also. Well, there's a story, and I just brought it to focus for today. It's a story. The story goes that we just recently lost a lawyer. His name was Andrew Strange. He was a great lawyer and honest by all accounts. And when he died, he said, do not put my name on the tombstone. He said, rather, what I would like to have is here lies the body of an honest lawyer. He says, because when people walk by, they go, wow, now that's strange. So now you don't have to have your name on the tombstone. Dad joke. The idea that's seen here is people have different ideas about the tomb, don't they? different ideas about what they want to do in their death, etc. Well, when you look and you turn to Job, the oldest of the patriarchs in the Old Testament, you go back to the beginning, as it were, he that was with the dinosaurs, etc. Job, in the long ago, he says, if a man dies, shall he live again? He understood the hereafter. He understood even the life that would be lived beyond the grave. And he says, all the days of my appointed time will I wait till my change come. Well, Hebrews 9 verse 27 says what? It is appointed unto man once to die, and after that, the judgment. And so this appointment, this moment in time when we will be resurrected as Lord, Job was actually looking forward to that. He was contemplating it. Are you contemplating the grave? It's not something that we talk about at the breakfast table, is it? But it is something that should be in our subconscious. It should be even in the forefront of our mind, because it has everything to do with our daily living. How is it that you're dying? That's a thought that we should have every day. Somber reminder of the place that we're going. Well, then there's David. David even is mentioned in Psalm 23, verse number 4. He said that he was not fearing the valley of the shadow of death. You know, think of the various places that he found himself. You know, you think about the sinful places that he was, the sinful things that he did. You think about the battles. You think about being chased by Saul. You think about all the things that he went through. Maybe even feeling that death was knocking at his door. And he says, I'm okay with that, because God is with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Too many people today, and you've probably heard statements similar, but I'm just scared of death. It's the great unknown. I don't know what to expect. I don't know if I'm going to die in a car accident. I don't know if I'm going to die in my sleep. And so for some reason or another, people often fear the grave, fear death. The underlying current there is that they're probably not right with God. The only reason to fear death and to fear the grave ultimately is because our souls are not right. Because David, a man after God's own heart, even with all he had done and even repented of, Psalm 51, says, I will fear no evil. I'm not scared of what man can do to me, is what Jesus said. Isaiah is another good example as you think about his looking toward the grave. The grave cannot praise thee, death cannot celebrate thee. In other words, while you're here, worship and praise all you can. Because when that moment comes, you're done. You're sealed. And that is, you're going to either paradise or Tartarus, just like Lazarus and the rich man. Worship and praise is something that happens on this side of the grave. And if you're named, well done, thou good and faithful servant in the last day, guess what we get to spend our eternity doing? Worshiping and praising God for all of eternity. And so Isaiah says, do it now. And then Paul, 1 Corinthians 15, O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory? You know what the sting of death is? Sin. And we talked about the apostate. We talked about the erring one that would die. We talked about those that are certainly ranked sinners, the wicked that die. That is a heavy sting. Even as we saw in 2 Peter chapter 2, for the erring child, what a horrible sting that the grave will be for those that go astray. And so Paul talks about it, certainly in Philippians, as he said, it's better to be with Christ. You add that to the conversation. And then Jesus, in John chapter 5. And this verse comes up quite a bit. Jesus says, marvel not at this, for the hour is coming. The grave is coming. Ecclesiastes 9 and verse number 10. In the which all that are in the grave shall hear his voice, and shall come forth, they that have done good unto the resurrection of life, and they that have done evil unto the resurrection of damnation. So there's a moment in time coming, Ecclesiastes 9 and verse number 10, where we are going to the grave to await this holy resurrection. And we're either going to praise or we're going to damnation, one of the two. And so Jesus announces that even in chapter 5 of John, leaving us then with this thought. Knowing all these things about the grave, knowing all these things that are about lying in front of us, in the same chapter, the resurrection chapter, notice that Paul says, but thanks be to God which giveth us the victory. we have an opportunity to go to the grave as victorious, as the child of God, Revelation 14 verse 13. Those that die in His arms, you might say, in the Lord. Because what do you see in paradise? Comforted in the bosom of Abraham. Great comfort, great joy awaits us that die in the Lord. And so marry with that 2 Corinthians 9 and verse 15, where the Bible says, thanks be unto God for His unspeakable gift, which is what? The gospel. In that context, it's talking about the great gift of the gospel, the power of God unto salvation, and ultimately that gift makes it possible to go to the grave as a victorious one. And so yes, we've talked about the grave, and we've talked about the aspects of it, who's going, and what to expect, etc., what others have thought about the grave, and there's a lot of information there. But the point that we need to draw is how we're going. How we're going to the grave. Because all we're doing now is dying, aren't we? Every single one of us are dying. As somber as that is, I mean, it is the truth. We are all dying. We're in the process of dying. How will you die? Well, if you rely on the gospel plan of salvation, you can die victorious. And that's what we hope to do. So tonight, if you're with us and this is a thought that has provoked some thought within you, we would love to help you with salvation issues, being obedient for the very first time, raised to walk in newness of life, Romans chapter 6, or even having the opportunity to come back in full assurance as an erring child coming back into the service of God. You could be subject to the call of God in this invitation on several different platforms, and if we can help you, let me know while we stand and while we sing.